Okay, I'm going to do a soft start as we have more people joining the session. Sometimes many people sign up and then they watch the recording. That's okay, but they're going to miss the ability to share their questions. Okay, welcome Michael from Tel Aviv, Rob from New Jersey, Ratna from where? United Kingdom, Sofia from Chicago, USA, and so on and so forth. We have people from Pia from Finland. Great to have you all. So the purpose of today, even if we have a lot of people joining beyond the US from global, we're going to talk about the state of US culture, and this is the result of a study. I'm going to share a little bit of the details later that we conducted, not only in the US, but also in many countries. The most important thing, I assume, probably wrong, that many of you have checked the report or at least the highlights. So I'm not going to repeat everything. I'm going to focus on the key themes from the report and try to give you some hints of what the future looks like, basically the what's next. Okay. I want to welcome everyone. We have more people joining. I want to learn, why are you here? What basically, what's your goal? What are you trying to get out of this session, and why are you joining us? So use the chat, please, and share why are you here. And share my thoughts. I'm here to spark a conversation. So not to tell you what to do or not to do, but basically, hopefully provoke some thoughts and maybe identify some stuff we have done. Love your content and love your insights. Thank you for that. Culture is still mysterious. Looking forward to see the results and insight. Well, it's going to be mysterious, but of course we're going to see what else we can get from there. How to stay ahead of changing times. Thank you, Ro. Eva, to learn more about US culture, understand the workplace culture and differences better. Also, Ranna, that is joining, as we said earlier, from the UK. She's supporting some clients who have US sites, and that happens a lot. When we talk about US culture, first, it has implications. I'm going to share later on other countries, but also many companies operate in multiple places. So what's happening in one place have ripple effects somewhere else. So if anyone else would like to join or share, sorry, that's okay. But quick intro for those who don't know me. I see many familiar faces, but also some new ones. My name is Gustavo Razzetti. I'm the CEO and founder of Fearless Culture. I'm also what we call a culture designer. So we help organizations intentionally identify who they are, what it stands for, what's the culture, and how people want to work together. I'm also the author of 3 books, and I would say 3.5 or 3 3/4, because there's one that's already on the editing and design phase. Hopefully will be available in May 2026. We work with different clients across the world and many in the US, facilitating courageous conversations to drive culture change, from large corporations to medium-sized or fast-growth startups across many industries. And we have also partners across the world representing the key areas like in Europe, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and so on. So for today, we're going to cover, as I mentioned, 3 things. First, what are the key insights from the research? And most importantly, I want to start discussing what's the way forward. And I'm not going to share a magic solution. There's none. Of course, it's depending on your context, on your company, but at least try to start a conversation, give you some hints, give you some food for thought that you can reflect on your own organization and if you're a consultant with your clients. And I want to leave a lot of time for us to also have a conversation. So if you have questions, if you have comments at the end, we're going to take care of those. So let's move into the study, the 2025 Culture Pulse, and this was an initiative from one of our partners, Eva, who's in the call, that she started with something and then it became, hey, what if we do it across the world? So it's a global study. basically we're running around 12 countries, and we're adding probably India and one more to the basically base. So this is going to end with a global report that we're going to share what are the key findings and what are the differences across the board. But of course, we are releasing different local reports. Today, we're going to focus on the US market. The study basically included in-depth interviews that, of course, we see through the lens of quantitative data that we have and all our direct experience working with clients. In the US in particular, we talked to 71 chief human resources officers from large companies, tech companies, and also a couple of nonprofit organizations. So the first thing is, I don't know if you remember, there was a phrase from a philosopher that said, the future ain't what it used to be. Well, culture ain't what it used to be. It's changing rapidly. And this is not about everything's changing. It's about culture, it's playing a bigger role, yet the paradox is we're not paying or giving it as much attention as it should. For many reasons, we're going to see how a culture is becoming at the front center of conflict. Culture, it's something that everyone prays, everyone says that it's really important. But one thing that happens when I ask, for example, CEOs, what do you mean by culture? People don't really know what they're talking about. They use it like a term that could be used for anything that means everything and nothing at the same time. We're going to see how the gap between what people think or say their culture is and how they behave, what they prioritize, the decisions they make, actually is creating a huge gap. And this is something that we're seeing not just in the US, but across multiple countries. We see three driving forces basically moving or shifting this situation. We see that culture is under pressure. There's a lot of things going on. First of all, fear and deflation. This is something, of course, because of the nature of our work, we're always talking to multiple people. We are interviewing multiple clients and so on and so forth, but never in our over 10-year experience working with people on culture, we've seen how people are so afraid, and afraid not of what's happening, but also afraid of speaking up on behalf of the org, on behalf of what's happening across the world, and so on and so forth. Just to give you a hint, most of the people that we interviewed said, I don't want to be quoted, don't mention my name, don't mention my company. And actually many say, don't even quote me, even if it's anonymous. So I don't want to be there. And one thing I was meant to mention earlier and I forgot, the interviews were conducted by Sofia Ansaldo, who's part of our team, Linda, where's Linda? I don't think she's in the call, and myself, right? And then we will focus on that. So this is something that one of the first things when we're starting the debrief, say, hey, what's happening here? People are really, really afraid, and not in one company, but across the world, the board. The second thing is the notion of trust, how it's been shaping and rebuilding in a post-pandemic world. We have a crisis. Remember, people forget the COVID. It hit really hard on a personal and work level, and companies were able to adapt. People were able to adapt, and that rebuilt a lot of great relationships at the workplace. But now we're seeing not only that we're losing that, but in many cases we're going backward. Well, not only we're losing the progress, but actually we're in an even worse situation before the pandemic happened. And lastly, we're going to talk about the importance of technology. Everyone's on this race to basically adopt new technology, to become more agile, AI first, but there's a huge gap between what leaders want to achieve and how they are preparing the skills, the mindsets, the behaviors that need to happen in order for people to be able to succeed in the new environment. I mentioned that culture is under pressure, and the most important thing is what are the key responses? And we identify like three types of groups when it comes to result. So people that basically, and this is not just about, of course, you're going to think, hey, we're talking about diversity. Yes, that's one key issue. But across the board, when it comes to culture itself, there's a huge group that are compliant. Compliant in the sense, hey, I care about culture because it's the thing that I need to do, because employees demand it, because my human resources demand it, the law demanded, whatever. And now that things are getting complicated, for lack of a better term, these guys are abandoning all their commitments. They say, you know what? I don't need to do this, so boom. So once again, they're showing their true colors. They never cared about culture, and then they're first to basically leave. On the other extreme, the good news, the same way we see a lot of news about people stopping their efforts, abandoning staff, forcing people to back to the office, and things that are bad news, and that's what sells the news. There's many cases that are not taking us many headlines of companies like Apple, to name a few, that are being unapologetic. Not only they keep on track, they keep most of the programs, they stick consistent, but actually they're even doubling down their efforts. Of course, no one's perfect, and that's something that we always need to keep in mind. However, and this might sound a little bit harsh, but it's important to understand many people or many organizations, because organizations are people, and leaders are deciding, you know what? I care about my team, I care about culture, I care about diversity. However, I don't want the backlash. So they are taking a more cowardly approach, trying to fly under the radar. They're renaming programs, they're not promoting them externally, they're trying to basically please their people, but also please the society and the government and so on. So in the end, they are in the worst case scenario, because these guys, at least they're being honest on the left, and people might be pissed off and say, hey, I don't want my company to behave like this, but I know they know what they're living here. At the center, we're finding lots of companies that are sending like confusing messages. People feel, oh, I care about you, but then they are silent. They don't step up when the news are taking over. So employees are really confused about, are my companies transitioning out? Are they abandoning the efforts, or they really care? So you cannot be on both sides. So first advice is you need to take sides. And I usually don't quote myself, so don't get me wrong, but this is something that I share in the report. If you have one key takeaway and you want to succeed, the future belongs to those who refuse to let fear dictate their behavior. So culture is not a one-off. You cannot make decisions based on what's happening in 2025 or 2026. You always need to keep the long-term vision, and the companies that are going to thrive are those that hold to those principles, especially when it's harder to do so. I always say that the true culture, it happens and shows up when there's conflicts, when there are crises. In normal times, it's easy to keep your culture because you're not being tested. When there's pressure, that's when you show what your true values are all about. Now, I mentioned culture matters. I know some people feel a bit offended when I joke about this, but it's true. Many people say culture is a priority, but actually they don't really know what they're talking about. So they say, when you say culture, what do you mean by that? And I would suggest that you ask that questions to other people. When you hear a leader saying, hey, our culture is important, people think that culture is just having a set of values or the way we work here, or maybe they think about more vague kind of principles. Culture has to do with mindsets, has to do with behaviors, has to do with emotions. The thing is, if culture is important or as important as strategy, why is it that in many companies it's one of the first things to be cut? I'm talking about programs, I'm talking about budgets when they were facing tough times. And reality is, many of the respondents say that, yeah, most of the time culture is one of the first things that is going to be affected. That doesn't mean that all efforts are abandoned, but it means that it's important, but not that important when they need to make tough choices. Now, we're seeing, and this is interesting because I was analyzing the reports from other countries, and this is one of the, maybe except a little bit for Sweden, but in most of the countries, this is super clear that there's not only a disconnect, but a growing disconnect between what leaders say and how they behave. We're seeing that people feel that there are two types of cultures: one culture for leaders, one for employees. One culture we use to recruit and hire people, one culture we use to how we treat people once they become employees. So this is, of course, important because trust is based on actions, not on words. And if you don't deliver, not only people are not going to trust you, but actually what's happening is people feel that the disconnect is getting worse and worse. Now, of course, the return to office is a big thing, and it's becoming more noticeable. But one thing that sometimes the media and some studies miss, to be honest, yeah, many large companies are forcing people back to the office, but that doesn't mean that every company is doing so. There are many companies, as I mentioned earlier, that are still operating 100% remote, or they continue to work on a hybrid environment and doubling down because they see the benefits. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but what's happening with the forced return is not just the fact that I need to be more at the office, that I'm losing the flexibility, that maybe now I need to get back to commute, and so on and so forth. Of course, that's a problem for employees. Of course, people complain that why do I need to be in the office to then sit on a desk and spend most of my days on Team or Zoom calls with my colleagues if I can do that from home? So what's the point of being home? So of course we hear that, of course those are big issues. But the most important point, and that where trust gets harmed, first, companies ask employees to take certain decisions. People move, people organize their lives, and now they say, you know what, I don't care. People were not involved in these decisions. This is kind of a mandate that comes out of nowhere and even last minute without a clear explanation. And many companies say the culture is suffering, the culture is suffering. But once again, they don't know what they're talking about. And actually, the culture is going to suffer more because of this forced return to office, because there's a lack of clear why. And people feel that they're being cheated or lied to. I mentioned DEI, and DEI is becoming a very kind of a sensitive topic. We know that the government has stopped a lot of contracts. We did some projects, for example, with the US Army, the Air Force, and we had to basically remove some language. It was the first time that people say, hey, psychological safety, it's a bad word. We cannot use it. And we start getting things that we've never imagined we're going to get from work. We also had to say no to a lot of projects that were against our own values because clients were trying to basically censor stuff. So we're not in the business of censoring language. And if you want to build authentic culture, what's the point, right? So this is becoming a thing. And we're going to talk about what are the options, what are the opportunities, how can we try to get out of this situation. I mentioned AI. Of course, tech, it goes beyond AI, but we know AI is the obsession of today's world. A lot with foundation, but also we are experiencing a little bit of a bubble. We know that most AI companies are not sustainable financially. They keep investing, and so at some point this might explode. And also we're seeing that many companies are starting to realize that some of the benefits that people predicted in terms of productivity, in terms of efficiency, are not as significant as they thought they were. We're starting to see a lot of time invested in correcting or filtering or improving the work delivered by AI, and then some of those efficiencies are actually erased. So let's try to explore, because that's the point. So once again, I don't want to be prescriptive. I don't want to look like the guy who has all the answer, because that's not my point. But I want to see some ideas and some principles that could give you some clarity, or at least start to have an interesting conversation. The first thing I like to take my clients is, when it comes to culture, either be bold or go home. I know this sounds extreme, but I mentioned those three groups that we're experiencing. If you don't take sides, if you're not clear and you want to be a wishy-washy trying to please everyone, not only you're going to end pleasing no one, but actually you're going to be in a situation that's going to be unsustainable. So be clear. Do you really care about your people? Do you really care about providing the right workplace? Or if not, don't waste your time, don't waste our time and your people time. The first thing that comes to this is we see there's a gap between what people say and how they behave. So either you change your behavior to match the words or change your promises. You cannot have both. So once again, be consistent. We use a tool. Some of the people in the call are familiar with it, but I keep using it a lot. One of the tools I keep going back, and I've been using this week with 3 different teams, executive teams, which is we need to understand what are the behaviors we punish and reward. And that basically is where culture goes to die. If you're not consistent, if we're not basically matching our words with actual actions, then nothing's going to happen. This is a tool that we use. I'm not going to explain it because of the goal, but what I can tell you is a great exercise is to ask leaders which behaviors do you think can get you into trouble in this company? What are call-outs? What could actually get you fired? And the other way around, what could get you promoted higher in this company because you're showing the right behaviors. Ask your team or ask different teams, which is what we normally do, and then try to see if the stories match. In our experience, working with hundreds of clients, in 95% of the cases, there's total inconsistent between what employees perceive and what leaders think they do. So the good news, when you find that out, at least that's a baseline, that's a starting point, and we can always improve it, right? So the point is not to show, this is not about making people feel stupid, hey, but ignorance is worse than acknowledgement. So we need to uncover this, see what the gap is, and how we're going to take care of that gap. Once again, either change your behavior or change your promises. Now, we need to stop using culture as an excuse. I'm not maybe speaking to you guys because you're here because you care, but many leaders and journalists continue to use loosely this term culture as an excuse for everything. And let me walk you through something really interesting. I mentioned Amazon and its forced return to the office, right? When they launched that effort, I don't know if you remember, but go and look back. Basically, the main reason is it's a culture thing. It's not productivity. No, we want to operate like the world's largest startup. So by forcing people to return to the office, we are going to make our culture stronger, right? So everyone was repeating this because who's going to go against culture, right? It's so big of a term that no one going to say, no, I wouldn't. So you cannot fight against it. But they never really explained why. They never showed any reason, any metric that supported this claim, but everyone bought into it. The media bought into it because, of course, they want to keep their culture alive. Now, recently, some are talking about 14,000. Some are saying that it's going to end in 30,000 employees are going to be fired. And this started last week from Amazon. We're talking about executives. And what's the reason that Amazon is using to fire those people? The culture. We want to be an entrepreneurial culture. We want to be an AI first culture. So we need to get rid of people. As you can see, people are using culture to get away with murder. They use culture to force people into office because they want to. They use culture to fire people because they want to. And this is exactly what we need to stop, what we need to fight, using culture as an excuse for whatever. Now, the most important thing, and I don't have anything against Amazon, but I think it's a great example all over the place, the consequences that leaders are not realizing when they get into this trap. Who are the first people to leave on their own? The best talent, the most senior people are either fired or they're going to leave on their own because they don't want to work in this kind of environment. And as many of you have experienced a few weeks ago, can't remember, I've been traveling a lot, but a lot of web services went down. A lot of services that were managed by Amazon AWS. So that stands for Amazon Web Services, that basically manages the traffic for many websites, not just for Amazon's, right? That's part of how they make a lot of money. Why this happened and no one explained? Well, not only because the traffic, Cloudflare, Amazon, so very few companies control most of the traffic to most of the websites, but also what happened is Amazon got rid of people because of culture, but there weren't many people who actually could do that job. And then the system started to crack. Unfortunately, you would think, hey, they realized this mistake, they're going to course correct it. My point, guys, get ready for more websites to stop working in the future because they are not basically going back. Now, one key thing that it's critical for culture and of course for remote or hybrid work is balancing freedom with discipline. And I think where people get it wrong is companies work on either extreme. When it came to working remotely, especially after the pandemic, companies became too flax to, hey, let people decide, let give. That's okay. And that's one of the key things in my book. It's people need to choose how they want to do the work. Teams need to have their own approach rather than have a company-wide approach. However, with freedom comes discipline. If you don't have clear team norms, if you don't have clear arrangements of how people need to show up, from simple stuff, from when to use camera or not in a call, how to show up, not like you just woke up from bed or from a nap, or most importantly, when people are available for meetings, what kind of work we do asynchronously, what kind of work we do in real life, how we're going to keep ourselves accountable, and so on and so forth. Without that discipline, freedom goes to die. Many companies didn't impose or didn't do any kind of thing to bring that discipline into play. They never, and I ask everyone every time they're facing this, I say, have you talked to your employees? Have you shared that you're complaining, that you're worried about, for example, discipline? Have you shared that you're worried about productivity, performance issue, culture issue? Have you? And most of the companies say, no, we haven't. So we jump from, we give you all freedom, then we start seeing things that aren't working, to we're going to change the game without involving people. I'm not saying people should dictate how your company work. I think that companies should inform how your company work because they are much smarter than I think. So this brings me to a concept of how can we balance accountability with ownership. Accountability is extrinsic, right? We make people accountable when we tell these are your job descriptions, these are the goals and metrics that you need to achieve. We promote responsibility. And we reward when people check the box and when they achieve certain metrics. Basically, this makes people accountable for their own action. However, a company needs to move beyond that. So it's not one or the other. We need both individual accountability, but also we need ownership. And ownership is something that happens at a collective level. It's intrinsic, right? I want to own my job. I feel responsible. I want to go above and beyond. If I see something, I want to do something. I want to improve it, not wait for my boss or colleagues to tell me to do so. It's a choice. Ownership is purpose driven and also promotes generosity. For example, in IKEA, shout out to Eva, they have this saying that's never with your hands empty, which means if you work in a store, it doesn't matter in which department, if you're the store manager or not, if there's something dirty, merchandise that's broken, something's missing, something's out of place, you are going to take care of it. You're not going to call the supervisor, you're not going to talk to the expert, you're going to take care of that. So and if you want to build a culture that has flexibility but also accountability, we need to work on the right side that most companies miss. How do we promote a culture of collective ownership, right, where people own their impact? Netflix also calls this like people who basically pick up the trash. So making sure that if you see something there on the floor, you're going to pick it up, not wait for someone else to do it. Now, and once again, as I mentioned earlier, I want to share some principles, not magical solution or silver bullets. The other thing that's important, and I wrote an article and I got a lot of backlash because of this, that the article was basically was DI is dead. And of course, people read it literally, and of course, I wanted to be provocative, but I didn't mean that the principles behind diversity should be dead, but I think that the way we approach it should be dead. I think that by trying to protect certain groups, we actually created a bigger divide than integrated. So diversity shouldn't be something, once again, like accountability, that we need to be accountable. How many people do we have? How many women? Check statistics, but actually, how do we create a culture that results in more women? For example, we know that companies have hired more women immediately become more diverse when they hire more women in leadership roles. We know that companies like Spotify, Allstate, an insurance company here in the US, and Airbnb have become more diverse, gender, in age, in any kind of I'm trying to think some of the stats, but I'm not going to throw them away and say anything. I can share later. But basically, because they offer flexibility, right? So they were able to hire people from more diverse backgrounds, more women into leadership roles, like a 30, that's the number, was close to 30% of increase in women in senior leaders, not managers. I'm talking about C-level positions because of flexibility. So when we work on the system, we're open mind, then the impact is much bigger than trying to change people's mind. And here in the US, we're seeing a lot of divide in the media, in relationships, and of course in the workplace, that basically by trying to promote certain groups, the other groups feel isolated and they're fighting back instead of trying to understand. And of course, this happens with out of positive intent, but my invitation is to reflect. So we need to build coalitions. We need to find how people can work together to build partnerships, not to continue working about groups. Also, people have multiple labels, so you have more than just one thing. You're multiple facts, and people need to start seeing that. The most important thing, that inclusion shouldn't be a zero-sum game where people perceive some people are going to get more opportunities and I'm going to lose the opportunity, right? It shouldn't be that how it's perceived or approached. So one of the things that's important for me, it's about not educating people on biases or stuff like that, which usually research shows that doesn't work, but focusing more on intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is not humility itself, it's the combination when you, on one hand, respect other viewpoints, and many diverse programs focus on this. Hey, you need to be open-minded, you need to be respectful, you need to understand. That's great, but open-minded on its own, it's not enough. We also need to make sure that people are willing to change their mind. So I can understand other people's point of view, but if then I keep thinking exactly the same, if I'm not able to challenge my underlying beliefs or principles or ideas, then I'm not really open-minded. So this is an important change that organizations need to focus not only on, hey, learn and respect different ideas, viewpoints, but also you need to train people on how to be able to change their mind. Because not that they need to change it, but when presented with new evidence, are you willing to admit, hey, I was wrong, now I learned something new? Usually this doesn't happen at the workplace, and when we look at leaders, most of leaders are not willing to change their mind. By the way, I can send you, if you're curious, we have a test that we do, an assessment that you can run like a quiz to see how you fare on all these variables. And when we run it with leaders, are the ones who usually score the worst when it comes to willingness to change their minds. So intellectual humility, it's about respecting other viewpoints. It's about challenging your intellectual overconfidence. It's not having low intellectual skills. It's that you are not thinking that you know more than I actually do, or thinking that your ideas are better than you think they really are. That overconfidence that gets you into trouble. It's about, of course, I mentioned willingness to review viewpoints, but that in order to get there, there's a huge shift in which we need to separate the ideas that we have from our identity. When people are so entangled, so connected, kind of a symbiotic relationship with the ideas, then they're never going to listen to other people's idea. Talking about AI and kind of trying to wrap up, codify your AI approach, right? One thing that's important, many companies talk about, we want to be AI first, we want to, but no one knows what they're talking about, what they really mean. They don't get into the second level, so they throw headlines that look cool, but people are totally, totally lost. We need to clarify the rules of the game. We want people to experiment, but what happens if people get it wrong? We have a lot of companies and a lot of research beyond ours that shows quantitative, that shows that when employees use AI, then their colleagues think that they are lazy, that they're unprepared, that they're cutting corners. So it's a duality that we're seeing, that on one hand we promote AI, but then when people screw up, there's a lot of clients don't have that appetite for risk taking, but also the company has a lot of rules that limit experimentation. People can only use tools that someone in tech or IT says there are. So instead of contradiction between what's promoted and actually what's really there. Lastly, we're putting a lot of emphasis into creating solutions, into generating content, and people are using AI to drive more content than ever. Most of that content is crap. And then the people who need to curate the quality of that content spend most of their time trying to fix a lot of shit, sorry, my friend, that comes from there because they're lazy and they're not doing stuff. So companies need to start talking more about the curation of the content and less about let's do more and more. So the emphasis on productivity is basically rewarding those who create stuff versus focusing on quality, which is curating the outcome, not just generating more and more stuff. Okay, so that's kind of about it. I'm going to skip this because we're running a little bit late and I want to have some time for you to ask questions, and then if needed, we can get back to some of those concepts. But before we jump into the question, if you have any comments, you want to continue the conversation, that's my email, you can reach out directly. So I'm going to open the floor if there's any comments or questions you guys want to tackle. Let me see the chat. And please use the chat to share your questions, or I can or say that you want to share something, I can unmute you. Let's try to keep the questions concise so we have a chance for many people to chime in, okay? So whether raise your hand or post something on the chat. And if you'd like to basically state your question using your mic, I can unmute you to do so. So we have a question from Nina. Do you work more with CHROs when working on culture change in orgs? Usually they are the client or the first client that reaches out, but we work mostly with the leadership team. So we don't want just to work with HR. If we don't involve all the executive teams, then change is not going to happen. But also we need to involve people from other teams, and we need to involve middle managers as well. So if we really want to drive a transformation, it cannot happen just focusing on one area, and culture cannot be limited to HR. And that's a problem that many companies think, oh, this is an HR thing. No, it's everyone's thing. Radna, let's see where you are. Can you unmute yourself?
Oh, yeah, I've done it now. Hi, Gustavo and everyone. I'm just really interested, like, culture it's more about mindsets, behaviors, and emotions. What role do you see leaders at this moment in time taking on being vulnerable? Because where I'm at, that's one of the things where they haven't got the courage to go into that space and have that vulnerability. And is that really what's holding them back and making it more process driven?
It is, but I think that language also plays a big role. So one thing I learned over time, I stopped talking about certain words that trigger, and not because I'm filtering words, but also trying to meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
So we use a lot of metaphors because, for example, senior engineers tell me we don't have emotions, and that's no, I'm not going to tell them yes, you have, but So I stopped telling leaders we're going to be vulnerable because then boom, they shut down. We work them through a process in which they end up being vulnerable, or them say, oh wow, this is super vulnerable, but we don't start there. They go through there and they end there. And I
Right.
think that's a great way. Meet leaders where they are. Don't come with a facilitator. You need to do this because then boom, you lose them.
Yeah. So, and I totally get that because I've stopped using that word as well because
Yeah.
it's become such a buzzword. Um,
So
and
I don't mean to cut you, but there are other people that have, and then
yeah,
we have
sure.
time. We
Yeah,
take us a follow-up
yeah.
question. So we have Roy. Why do you think so many companies do not know what culture means to them? That's a great point. I think that we live in a world that people like to throw the growth mindset, psychological terms that most people don't know what they're talking about. And actually, many of those terms have evolved into different meanings. And first, it looks cool, no? There's this saying that culture it's strategy for breakfast that Peter Drucker never said it and actually it's wrong, but people keep repeating because it's one of those cool things you find on social media. And people do it because if you say that, you feel that you're cool, but they don't know what they're talking about. So I think that applies to culture. First of all, most leaders, they come from finance background, legal background, whatever. MBAs, they haven't maybe been trained, basic training on what culture actually is. And that's a starting point. So I'm not judging them for not knowing. I'm judging those people that work with them and never ask the question. And when they don't know what they're talking about, they don't try to find common ground or help leaders actually define what culture really is. So it's a basic training thing. And then the people around them, they're assuming that everyone knows what they talk about, but no one asks the right question. So Eva, were you able to unmute yourself? It was working. Can you try again?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Old thinking. I run the Sweden Culture Pulse, and Swedes are really fixed in old thinking and behaviors. And that is a large barrier, like for the AI, etc. How large impact? How does it look like in US, and is it a large impact for the organization in US?
Can you repeat the first part?
Absolutely. We are really fixed in old thinking and behaviors from the report. And when I've spoken to other experts here in Sweden, if we compare that to US, old thinking, fixed thinking in US, is it a large barrier for organizations in US? Because it is a large barrier here.
It's a barrier everywhere because people are adopting AI, and this happens not just at a workplace level, but as a society. And no one is really thinking what kind of world we want to live in, right? So no one wants to be left behind. No one wants to feel perceived as also. We are adopting stuff to be part of the, to be on the same bus and be cool. But then when it comes to workplace, what kind of collaboration are we looking? Is, for example, for me, AI should be like another team member and should be integrated as a collaborative tool. And many people are using more at individual levels in companies. So basically, everyone's using AI on their own. Of course, there are some process and stuff that people are using, but mostly they are using AI and actually trusting AI more than trusting their their colleagues, right? Research shows. So I agree that we need to think what are the beliefs that drive collaboration, that have human interaction. How do we want AI to amplify, enhance that, and then see what happens? So we have people that saying AI is going to replace human. People say, no, there's some stuff that are inherently human that they are no. That binary conversation doesn't help. It's not one or the other. It's a combination of both. And we need to think, what are we trying to achieve as a company and how AI? The focus on productivity I mentioned earlier. We need to do more, we need to do more. Then we're adopting technology to amplify a lot of mistakes that are already happening versus becoming better. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Mm-hmm. Dan, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Gustavo. This is Dan. Quick question. The systems are getting a lot more complex, and decision-making within complex systems is very difficult in cultures that promote a different way of moving forward in behaviors. I'm coming across that in our corporate setting. And so are you working through that process of helping create, or how do you create culture that realizes that you can't have a plan for 5 years in advance, that you have to actually be able to be somewhat flexible and ready to pivot and agile and all those other things? Because there's a distinction between the idea of, hey, I'm going this far and we're going to plan for 4 months, 6 months, 2 years, and it ends up being a culture where the behavior of the teams that are doing that just really goes haywire. And just curious if you've thought through that process at all.
Absolutely. We work with companies in many things. One is navigating ambiguity, because that's what we need to understand. It's not change itself. People talk about change accelerating. Change has happened and accelerated since we started living on this planet, right? And people have been talking about the fast speed of change in the 70s, in the 60s. So this is not new. The way it manifests is new. For me, it's more about understanding that a lot of things are really complicated, even chaotic, that we cannot understand, and how leaders divide and conquer. What are the things that we can clarify and make sense out of it and focus there? And what are the things that are maybe too far away, too complex, and make sure we don't get anxious? There's a lot of anxiety also, not just because of the political environment here, but also because of things that are happening and people are spending too much time into the chaotic place versus focusing on what they can control. So we work with organizations to say, where do you need to focus your attention? And also, to your point, how do we divide and conquer when it comes to decision making and making sure that we can move decision making and certain aspects more to teams? Lastly, thinking about the long run, that's why we need to be clear, what are the leadership principles that we're using? So the strategy is going to change, the direction might change, but the principles should help us adapt and navigate that uncertainty, right?
Thank you.
Sure. Any other comment or questions, guys? Okay, so we're going to wrap up, and thank you again for joining me. And for those who couldn't make it live and watching the recording, thank you for being part. And of course, reach out if you have any questions or if you need any help with your own culture. Great to see you. Have a great day.